Oh man, y'all, episode 7. There is so much to I really don't think I'm gonna be able to touch everything. There is so much to unpack here. And I wasn't really honestly prepared for this much in this episode. Cause a narrative driven episode is kind of a mixed bag. It could either be a huge amount or it could be like practically nothing. So let's just kind of get down to it, right? When it comes to this episode specifically, basically we're coming to grips with all of the characters that are not necessarily affected by the charm. That's really deep down what we are dealing with, and it's Freya Familia damage control. So right out of the gate, we find out that obviously we know that Hestia and Uranus are not affected. They kind of know each other, not affected. They kind of have come to more or less an understanding and an agreement. But the problem they've got is that Fels is affected. And without saying it as much, it is alluded to that anyone that is affected by the charm also kind of becomes an earpiece for Freya. So, or if nothing else, at least they can't be trusted, so to speak. So, Fels can't say, Uranus can't say much around Fels, and he warns Hestia, he's like, this is not a safe place. We cannot have this conversation here. And he tells Fels to prepare the Hermes Familia for, I guess, a gathering of goods and things like that they're going to need for the winter season. And Fels is like, that's normally the dominion of the Ganesha Familia. And he's like, yeah, Ganesha Familia is going to be busy with the Freya Familia. Now, what's interesting here is the charm kind of glow fades from Fels' eyes. And I don't think the charm is worn off. I don't think that was like some kind of secret code or anything that they had, which is, I'm sure, so what some people are speculating. But essentially what we're looking at here is a situation where the Freya Familia, we're a little ahead of where I am in the novels at this point, unfortunately, but the Freya Familia essentially just has their fingers in everything. Now, we also find out that Ryu is not affected, and Osvi is not affected. We've known Bella's not affected. And then we find out that Anya's not effective. Now, for those of you that aren't terribly familiar with Anya, because she hasn't had a huge part in the mainline series, they do reveal in a couple episodes ago that Anya is the brother of... Anya's the sister of one of the Freya Familia members, Alan. And, Anyway, the long and the short of it is she's not affected. None of the Freya Familia, or none of the upper echelon of the Freya Familia are affected. Like, her inner circle is not affected. All the other characters, all the other players out there, and anyone that's like a grunt level in her Familia does seem to be affected. So, that is what that is. But basically, Anya kind of goes on a quest. She's like, does nobody remember Seer? What is going on? And she's approaching Chloe, who's like her closest companion. They used to have their own thing. If you haven't read the light novels or played the games, you don't know. But essentially, they had their own whole thing going on long before this story began. And Chloe's like, what are you talking about? Who's Seer? I've never heard of this person. And even Lunar's like, I have no clue. I have no clue what you're talking about. And she goes to Mamma Mia. And Mamma Mia... Now, the thing you gotta remember about Mamma Mia is like Otaro level of power. Like, she is a legitimate powerhouse. I forget her exact level, but she is up there. And she seems unaffected. So it almost feels like, for the most part, level and strength and all that might have something to do with the effects. It's also mentioned that the Xenos are not necessarily affected, but also they were in the dungeon, and it was mentioned in the previous episode that the town of Riveria, like as a whole, was unaffected just because, they're down in the dungeon. So anyone that's in the dungeon pretty much is already counted out on this. But Mamma Mia's not affected, and Mamma Mia's like, oh yeah, I remember her, this. You would be best to forget her. You would be best to steel yourself and just pretend like none of this ever happened. And Anya's losing it. She's got no clue what she's talking about. She flips out, and she happens to see Alan in the street, and Alan basically has her come along with him, and he's trying to explain like, hey, this is what's going on, just stay out of the way. Like, clearly Alan always gives off this vibe of like self-importance and like he's got a chip on his shoulder, but he clearly cares to a certain extent. Now, the way he shows it isn't always the best, but he very clearly cares. And I just realized I jumped in here without getting into the numbers. We'll do the numbers here in a few minutes, so make sure you guys stay put to the end. We'll talk about it. But basically, Alan knocks Anya out, and that was really used as a way to drag Ryu out of hiding. Freya even mentions to Alan earlier in the episode, she's like, Asvi and Ryu have escaped the city. They're not affected. They are not under her control. I guess she can tell who is and is not under her control, which isn't going to work out well for Hestia either. But, so Asvi and Ryu, she knows her. They're coming back, basically casting a net, and that's essentially what Alan is. Alan is the trap for Ryu, and of course Ryu gets trapped, and you find out that Freya's there, and she appears as Seer. This is where I'm going to kind of get into the Foley design here. There's a lot to just unpack about this whole situation. And basically it's the admission that the whole time she's been at the tavern as Seer. And both Anya and Ryu just kind of have to come to grips with it. And they don't really deal with it very well, but who would? Let's face it. Like, you find out that you've been duped this entire time. And she even mentioned, she's like, it was just playtime. Like, legitimately, I was role-playing. What do you want, right? The whole thing is just a cluster. And at the end of the day, you find out that basically Bell has been doing his own thing. He's now training. He has more or less been gaslit into believing almost that that he's always been part of the Freya Familia. And what's really interesting, Freya admits she knows about Bell's ability now, obviously. She knows the charm won't work, but she mentions that ability can get weaker based on like his emotional state. So if she can like break his mind, she can break his ability. So we now know what she's striving for. We know why she's doing all of this. And it's almost effective. Like it's getting really, really close to being a legitimate, honest threat. However, and what's really, really interesting to me here, as all of this starts going down, she is talking in private with Belle in her chambers, and Belle looks at her and goes, he mentioned Seer, and Freya loses it. Absolutely loses it. And it makes sense. Like, she wants everyone to forget. Like, that was her. That was not her. Or that was her, but it was not her. That's the persona that she would rather everyone forget about. And, obviously people aren't going to do that very quickly. But there's just so much going on here. So much to unpack. Fantastic episode. Had me on the edge of my seat the whole time. I'll go into the numbers. Raw numbers, story-wise, I'm going to give the story 10 out of 10. Fantastic. Omori has built enough into the plot threads to really give us this level of foreboding, but hope at the same time, and then slowly, giving us that level of hope and then dragging it away. And at the end of the end of the episode, where you have that hope, where we're like, Asvi is now cloaked and she's going out and doing her thing. The Phasma player in me hated that last scene, though. The door opening and closing like that in the wooden shack. I'm like, it's Grafton. But nevertheless, neither here nor there. Some of you will appreciate that reference. But story-wise, 10 out of 10. Omori just knows how to string us along at this point. This is just absolutely fantastic writing. Love it. Absolutely love it. 10 out of 10 story. Fully sound design, I'm going to give it a 9. And only reason I'm going to do that is there were a couple of moments. Like, I absolutely loved when they kind of go between Freya and Sears, because they're two different voice actresses that portray those characters, and when they go between them when she kind of transforms and all that, it takes a great amount of talent for the characters to kind of pick up on the flow and the basically the temperament and all of that of the scene. It's not an easy thing to portray. So the sound direction is great. The voices were on point. The Foley art is where I have a little bit of a gripe this episode. When Anya gets knocked back, she lands with kind of a thud. It's a can sound we hear all the time. But what irritates me is there's a sound of like dust, but she lands on like a brick ground type of thing. Not in the dirt or the grass where that would make more sense. I get it's probably just a canned sound that they used, but it's to me, I think the Foley probably could have used a little work. So I'm going to give it a 9, just because I can't in good faith give it a 10. I gotta take a point off for that. However, animation wise, it's real hard in an episode like this to sit down and to, because it's a lot of narration. Now, when they kind of have the narration and all that going on, there's not a lot of camera movement. There's a lot of static scenes. And I mentioned, I think, last episode, when you have static scenes like that, it makes more sense to kind of artificially inflate the scene, so to speak, like blow it up to 105% or something of that nature, and then slowly like pan, tilt, zoom, do something to create gravity in the scene. And based on how you affect that will affect how you feel about a scene. There are some movies that have done with great effect to change aspect ratios, so basically the resolution of the shot within a movie, and you don't even realize that it happens sometimes, but it does, and it changes how you feel about it. So based on whether like a zoom can build tension, a zoom out can release tension, a pan or a tilt or something of that nature can really like emphasize a mood or a character or something of that nature. And it's something JC Staff, a very old school style in their animation, as I always say, but they really don't pay a lot of attention to this kind of stuff. The other thing that really irked me in this episode was towards the end, where Freya and Belle are kind of sitting on this couch, but there's no gravity to them. When they sit, nothing like contorts, nothing changes. It's once again a very old school way of doing things, where it's a matte painting underneath them. It's literally like a painted canvas that they could reuse over and over and over and over and over for different scenes. But there's no, or sometimes it's even done in 3D in a lot of modern aspects, but there's no weight to them. Nothing, like there's a shadow, but it's a flat shadow. There's no bending, there's no contorting, there's absolutely nothing to tell us that when they sit, they sink into the chair. When Freya pulls open the drawer is clearly drawn very differently. Anybody who's watched like an old Scooby-Doo cartoon remembers like you'd have these beautiful matte painting settings, and then the one boulder that's like very clearly out of place because, you know, they have these beautiful landscapes and then the boulder that the animator has to animate. So it's a very old school way of doing things. And while I do appreciate a certain amount of that, we have modern techniques, like especially with, you know, talking about the drawer itself. You could have your painter paint the drawer face and then digitally move it when the animator draws the drawer coming out. There are ways that you can add digital effects. I think I talked a little bit in the past, and it's a very controversial statement, about using artificial intelligence to kind of make to make tweens, scenes between scenes. So like when your animator draws the drawer open, the drawer shut, there's another animator that draws that drawer coming open, but they only draw, you know, every other frame of animation. in this day and age, we have tools, and I've used one in some stuff I've done recently that literally make those extra scenes come up based on AI. You feed in the scene, AI uses all of that. And AI is not intelligent enough now, and probably should never be, if I'm honest, to make that whole scene by itself. I mean, you can, but it's going to look weird. Having an animator use that tool to make up every other frame of animation takes a lot of the workload off your animator. And JC Staff is the company that I would imagine, for the sake of, it's a very controversial statement to make, but for the sake of their studio and their way of doing things, they will probably never, ever, ever do that. But there are other studios which I assure you are doing that and have been doing that for probably quite a bit longer than you realize. So when it comes to the animation, I'm going to give it a 7 only, and that's probably a harsh statement, but I'm only going to give it a 7 because there are simple things that they could easily fix, things that in the digital era we could very easily do. And unfortunately, it adds, well, if anything, it doesn't really add much, but the same animators doing the same amount of work, you just have one person take an extra half hour of work, come in and touch up a scene. It does add production time, but it's a human being in another job that you can add in there that adds so much more leverage, gravity, and depth to a scene. I've harped on this enough. I keep teasing that I'm going to do a whole video on this, and I've never actually pulled it out, but I guess this is close to what I keep meaning to do. But I feel like a 7 is a fair assessment of it, but I want more. I want JC Staff to come into the modern era of animation. I want them to... I don't want to see the stuff that I saw, tricks of the trade from 30, 40, 50 years ago. I want to see an anime that is very modern, very new in 2024. Maybe it's, call it a hot take or whatever, but that is just what I see when I see this animation. And I think they did a really good job last season of adding CGI effects and things like that. When you added, the monsters and you animate the monsters. Last season, I think they did a better job of it. And I think it's just because it's a narrative-driven season, they've kind of reeled it back. And I would love to see just a little bit more from them. So, who knows? If you want to know my honest opinions on all this, compare the reviews of this to my reviews of Wistoria, another property by Fujino Omori that I loved and is very modern, very, very... utilizes those techniques. I implore you, see the difference between these two franchises, and you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. But that's my take. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. Rip me up for using that one terminology that I know everyone's going to hate, but it's my honest opinion, and it is, I think, just a tool. Not a replacement, a tool. And I think that's an important variation. Anyway, like, comment, share, and I'll be back with more coming up real soon.